Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. I'm your host, Graham Culbertson, and my guest today is John McGowan. John's been on the show several times. John was my dissertation director. John is my mentor. John is the liberal voice of conscience, sometimes in my mind and sometimes in my living room. So, John, thank you for coming back on the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here again, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
All right, so we are here to talk about this little book that Library of America published. I saw it and I just got interested in it, so I asked you to come on the show. It's called On Civil Disobedience, it's just two essays stuck together with an introduction. One, Henry David Thoreau's famous essay, Resistance to Civil Government, which is everyone calls On Civil Disobedience for some reason. I'm not sure when it got that title. Civil Disobedience is not Thoreau's title. And then an essay written, I want to say like in 1970 by the German American, at one time stateless philosopher Hannah Arendt, which was responding to crises in the law and in justice in 1970, that looks back on Thoreau's essay and also looks extensively back on the famous Plato dialogue. Is it the Crito? Is that how you say it? Yeah, it looks like Crito, but it's the Crito is what the people say. And so we're not talking about Socrates today, but we will try and talk briefly about Thoreau and then talk about this Arendt essay and what she does with Thoreau. John, does that sound right so far?
We're on the same page. Yeah, good.
Okay, so let me start briefly with this essay on civil disobedience. As listeners know, 19th century and early 20th century American studies was my dissertation. So this is in my wheelhouse. And Thoreau's essay, and this is, I think, controversial in anarchist studies, but also Ruth Kenna, the great anarchist scholar, I've talked through this idea, and she says it makes a certain amount of sense from intellectual history. In a sort of social history of anarchism, anarchism is a thing that starts in Russia and then moves to France and Switzerland and then spreads worldwide. But I would also say that the single most influential essay in the history of anarchism is this essay, Thoreau's On Civil Disobedience. And the lineage is very simple. Emerson, who is my favorite of these thinkers, has all of these ideas about self-reliance. He's very influenced by a variety of romantics. His friend and student, Henry David Thoreau, takes his ideas and makes them much more concrete, most famously in this book, Walden, where he lives in Walden Pond. And then the other thing that everyone knows and reads by Thoreau is this essay on civil disobedience or resistance to civil government, which essentially says you should never let the state tell you to do something that you don't agree with. And furthermore, you should withdraw all support from the state that you don't agree with. And I'll let you respond to the content of Thoreau's essay in a second, but first I just need to tell the lineage. So a Russian novelist named Tolstoi reads this essay and is greatly influenced by it when he's developing what he would say anarchism, except for without violence. I would just call it nonviolent anarchism. He sends this essay to the political campaigner Mohandas Gandhi, who also reads this essay. So Gandhi and Tolstoy use this essay as the foundation for their version of anarchism. It eventually influenced Bayard Rustin and Martin Luther King. And so although Thoreau is often not claimed as an anarchist, and sometimes Tolstoy and Gandhi and King are not claimed as anarchists, even Graeber says this, the most influential anarchist action in the history of anarchism are the actions taken by Gandhi and his followers. And so uh, I I did an interview on Gandhi, and I actually deleted my Facebook account because I had posted in the notes something like, in this interview, Gandhi emerges as the central or most important figure of anarchism, and that enraged the academic anarchists. But I'm actually willing to sort of stand by that. Graeber says Gandhi was the major political figure of the 20th century, most influenced by anarchism. So if you're looking at the ideas of anarchism and then them actually making a difference in the world, this Thoreau essay actually is the central thing. Not Kropotkin, not Bakunin, not Goldman. Um, okay, so that was my anarchist introduction. And now, John, anything you want to say in response to that or about the Thoreau essay? I've been talking a lot.
Well, I would make just two starting comments, and they both actually play off Arendt's response to Thoreau. So the first is her statement, and it seems pretty clear that Thoreau's action is utterly individual. So for her, it's more like being a conscientious objector, that you just individually say, this is against my conscience, I find this immoral, so therefore I secede. But it makes no attempt to address the polity or to make any kind of change. Thoreau says, that's not my business. I'm just
Yeah.
here to be true to myself. The world can wag as it will. And then the second thing, and Arendt mentions this briefly, and this really gets to the issue of Gandhi, is the confusion, or the conflation would be a better word, of civil disobedience with nonviolence. So I guess I would, Tolstoy, Thoreau doesn't really touch on this, and I guess I would see this as Tolstoy's addition, this addition of the notion of nonviolent resistance. And so that shifts things in terms of what the emphasis is, because it adds an additional condition that not only will you disobey, but your disobedience will be nonviolent.
Yeah, and I mean whether or not that's a new thing from Tolstoy or whether something that's sort of implicit in Thoreau. I mean, Thoreau, if he wants violent resistance, John Brown is right there. It's very clear that Thoreau is not going to practice violent resistance, and there are violent resistors. So I might be more inclined to say that Thoreau is arrested, he's put in prison, he doesn't he doesn't do violence at any time. So I might suggest that the nonviolence is implicit in Thoreau. It is made explicit by Tolstoy, and then the Gandhian edition, which is obviously the one that makes it the world bestriding idea, is you make it an organized, powerful social movement instead of one guy who no one would have heard of if he weren't friends with Ralph Waldo Emerson.
I mean, this would get into the complicated question of Thoreau's attitude towards John Brown. Because Thoreau, in fact, publicly, I mean, again, it's complicated, but he publicly supported Brown in the sense of Thoreau is interested in symbolic gestures, which of course lead to violent anarchism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I don't think there's any doubt that Thoreau supported. I mean, Thoreau and eventually Emerson both supported. I mean, Emerson certainly supported the massive state violence that we call the American Civil War, but neither of them, and they've been criticized for this since the American Civil War, neither of them went to the barricades or even seem to have really considered it.
Right. Well, I mean, that, of course, is the other thing about the Thoreau essay, if we place it in its historical moment. I mean, Thoreau wants to carry out an individual secession.
Yeah.
And of course, this is a time in American history when precisely the question of the right to secede is central. And it raises the question of should the American North have let the South secede instead of forcing the South back into the Union?
Yeah. So let's I'm going to have a brief response to that and then I want to hold my tongue, but actually, this comes up again. And you and I, John, you and I have been discussing this for as long as we have been discussing these ideas. In general, I believe it's considered that it was bad to let the South secede. But of course, we want Quebec to be able to secede from Canada if they're going to be more left wing and closer to what we want. The Catalans should be able to secede. The Basques should be able to secede. All of the left wing groups, we want them to be able to secede. But if the right wing groups want to secede to have more oppression, that's bad and wrong. And that just seems like a incoherence.
Well, I mean, hey, if Texas wants to secede, I'd say good riddance, go. I'd love to see Texas secede. I wrote about this when Biden got elected. I said he should do a reverse Lincoln. Let him go.
Yeah, I mean, look, now we're just at the heart of these questions. We're not proceeding systematically, but I'm okay with that for now. We can step back and do this systematically. And again, Arendt does this. Abraham Lincoln these days is a hero because he defeated slavery. But in his own time, what he viewed his project to be and what he was a hero for was keeping the state intact, would be the mean spirited anarchist way of putting it. But I would say saving the Union. That would have been the positive. Like, what did Abraham Lincoln do? It wasn't that he freed the slaves. It wasn't that he made uh, America a more just and peaceful place. He does say that as the ultimate goal, but along the way, it is no, you are not allowed to leave this union, and we will use military violence if you declare that you are your own government. And of course, people use the word confederacy to mean something negative and bad and racist now, but confederacy or confederation was also the name for the more anarchic version of the United States that was defeated by the more hierarchical and violent version of the United States that we American liberals we we cherish so much. It seems to me like we like the Declaration more than the Constitution sometimes, but in general, we kind of like. Does not American liberalism like that iron hand more than it does, the Jeffersonian dream?
Well, I mean, this is, of course, the argument against anarchism. The argument is if you allow anarchism, if you allow the Confederacy, it will be based precisely upon extreme oppression. You can't have the Confederacy without the slavery. You can't have Texas without its attempt to deport immigrants.
Yeah, no, I agree. The flip side is though, right? Presumably, you could have had a United States of New England without slavery. And, you could have had Quaker freeholds all over Pennsylvania. And again, today, you could presumably have a left wing. I don't think we would actually have a left wing Catalan utopia if we got a free Catalunya, but it sure seems like throwing off the Madrid yoke would lead to a more democratic socialist, at least Catalonia.
Well, except so first of all, I'm totally down with a right to secede. I think there should be a right to secede. Here's my worry. You get Czechoslovakia, and all of a sudden now it's Czech and Slovakia. You
Yeah.
secede, right? The political units get smaller and smaller, while the economic units in our current world get larger and larger. So the oppression is just going to move to the economic realm. You're going to have the seven companies that rule the world with no political entity big enough to even in any way control them.
Yeah, no, I mean this seems right. This seems right to me. So this is if anyone has read the Mars trilogy by Kim Stanley Robinson, this is what happens. Eventually, the state ceases to be an effective unit, but it's just there's really big corporations, and eventually the corporations go to war with one another, and the states are just sort of along. The states are just along for the ride.
Seems plausible.
Yeah. Well, I guess since we're already well off the track I laid out for us, which is way more fun and way more anarchist. Um, what do you say then, John? So if one wants to be a liberal and have liberal values, which I am all for, I am on the record as saying frequently that liberal values and anarchist values are more or less the same thing. This is what Hobsbawm says. It seems roughly correct to me. The big difference on the ground is that the liberals, one of my guests, Luke Kemp, put it this way, is the liberals are against too much acquisition of state power. But the liberal doctrine of private property seems to just open the door for infinite corporate power. So how can one, if one is, if one holds liberal values, must one not therefore give up the liberal value of private property, or one ends up signing off on an authoritarianism as bad as the Soviet Union?
Now, again, it's always about checks and balances. So, I mean, this Arendt was very clear about this in lots of her writing, that what you want to do is distribute power. So, because it's equally oppressive if you take away all private property, then the state has all the power in its hands. Private power is a countervailing property against the state. The question is getting the balance right. And it's clear at the moment the balance is not right. That, but again, that was a deliberate achievement by the right-wing business conservatives. They started this in the 1940s, against the New Deal. And it took them 30 or 35 years to get the political ascendancy. But there has been a shift in the balance of power away from the state and towards the economic. And that needs to be rewrited. But just saying abolishing private property, that just is another formula for tyranny. It's just tyranny, state tyranny, rather than economic tyranny.
Yeah, and I'm going to mention again, listeners will have heard me say this probably relatively recently. I'm not quite sure when this episode is going to come out, but the first person to use the word anarchist to describe himself, Proudhon, has been slammed by the anarchists ever since then because he defends the right to hold a small amount of property, what we might call personal property, one's own home, one's own garden. And he's been attacked, certainly from a Marxist perspective. There's no real distinction. Property is theft, as Proudhon would say. But Proudhon wanted people to be able to ultimately, and Jefferson wants the same thing, despite the obvious problems in Jefferson's own life, in that he was not a small property holder, and he was, in fact, not just a plantation owner, but an enslaver. But nevertheless, Jefferson and Proudhon both say a society of people, all of whom have a little bit of property, is okay. And then, someone like, if Marx says, we are against the bourgeoisie, and he means Rockefeller and Vanderbilt, the petty bourgeoisie that Proudhon is defending, that is, and again, I discussed this extensively with Luke Kemp in respect to James C. Scott's work, that's just a category error. The Marxist who says, you own 40 acres and a mule, you are therefore part of the capitalist class. You own 4 million acres and 10 railroads. You are also part of the capitalist class. Let us do war on the capitalist class. That's wrong.
Well,
That's
you
wrong.
can't have a right to secede unless you have a Walden pond to
Yeah.
a place to secede to. And maybe the difference here, and I don't know if you want to get into this, but after all, Thoreau is vociferously individualistic. And so he has no interest in communism in relation to some kind of communal sharing of anything. I mean, Thoreau's whole point is that I don't let anybody else say to me what's right or wrong, and I certainly don't believe the majority is going to be right. I actually have great suspicion of the majority. I just need to have my right to be follow my individual star.
Yeah, so I think that's right, but I and this is a place where I my reading of Thoreau and Emerson I think is different from many people because Thoreau and Emerson are friends and they support one another. And in their screeds against community, I think they're really talking about, what we might call an abstract community or an enforced community. They obviously have no objection to community itself. I mean, the traditionally the New England town is what people think of when they think of a community in America that that works. I think they just took it for granted. Neighborliness or mutual aid. Okay, I see you disagreeing. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I mean, again, this would just like it's complicated their relation to John Brown. Now the complication would be their relation to Brook Farm. Neither one of them was a joiner. Neither
No.
one of them was at all interested in joining up to Brook Farm. So I think they prized their individualism. They were pretty prickly about their individualism and its distance from any communal enterprises.
I still think they were totally against communalism in its abstraction, and they just accepted it as everyday. Although, I mean, look, they feuded with one another and lots of other people.
Right. Yeah,
There's
prickly is the right word for them.
Yeah. So the place, to stick with Emerson for a bit. I mean, honestly, this is great. We're just spending more time in the 19th century than I was planning on. But and you've been bringing Arendt back in. We'll have to leap over this 120 years to get to Arendt in a bit. But the place where I make this argument, I don't think I've made it in this on this podcast yet. But there's a thing in I don't remember which Emerson essay it is. It might be Self Reliance. It's certainly one of the big ones where he objects to his neighbors who are celebrating abolition, I think, somewhere in the Caribbean. And he has been attacked ever since then. Christopher Benfey attacks him for this, for, not being sensitive to this. But what he says is, what about the rude woodcutter in your backyard? And I think maybe the problem is rude woodcutter is not a term that we understand in the 21st century. But what he means is you, Massachusetts petty bourgeoisie, are celebrating the abolition of slavery, and yet you don't chop your own wood. And in fact, the person who chops your wood is living on starvation wages paid by you. And what you need to do is not try and take part in a global war against slavery, but figure out that you're in fact starving your neighbor. And this becomes not quite radical enough, but it becomes too radical for people to accept.
Well, of course, the problem is that's exactly the argument that was made by the slaveholders. And so it's a tainted argument because the slaveholders, very loudly kept on saying the true slavery is in the North. Our slaves are much better off than the rude woodcutter because we don't let our slaves starve.
Can't we just say that there was wage slavery and chattel slavery? And I'm willing to go out on a limb and say chattel slavery was worse, but they were both bad. And the hypocrisy of the people who did wage slavery while attacking chattel slavery deserves to be attacked both then and now, even if it makes us sound like Calhoun occasionally.
Right, but except that it seems a little bit strict to say, I can't celebrate some progress on one issue because some progress hasn't been made yet on the other issue. I mean, so, it's like saying, I can't celebrate that my child has survived measles, even though someone else's child hasn't.
No, because these are people who are wearing clothing that was woven from cotton by wage slaves in England, that was sent to England after being grown by chattel slaves in the southeast. So they're fully partaking in the chattel slavery business, reaping its rewards while criticizing chattel slavery, while also underpaying and exploiting their very own neighbors as they are praising themselves for how little exploitation they are doing.
Right. So people don't understand the supply chains. And no, and not only that, but after all, the supply chains are deliberately being obscured precisely so you can wear your T-shirt in good conscience without thinking of the person in Guatemala or Vietnam who made the T-shirt.
Yeah, I mean, just the only other last thing I want to say in terms of like it being a tainted argument is that this is the famous anti-slavery Adams family that produced, two presidents, both named John Adams, confusingly, although one of them we say his middle name, and then also the diplomat, novelist, and memoirist Henry Adams. This is Henry Adams's critique. So Henry Adams sort of turns against the Adams family, but when he is growing up, he says we Adamses would be confused because we would run into pro slavery people and they would say, oh, that Boston, those guys are all anti slavery. Boston is anti slavery. But the Adams family line was that because Boston was a major part of the supply chain, is that Boston and Charleston were two just utterly equally centers of the slave industry, and that the big enemy, since it was the nearby enemy to them that the Adams hated, was not Charleston but Boston for being so pro slavery. And so we just trying to put Emerson in that tradition.
Right, and so they're all nodes in a network where we're talking about globalization, where everything is interconnected. So then the question becomes about Thoreau precisely: is there in fact a clean space to which you can
Mm-hmm.
retreat? And I mean, after all, Thoreau is also virtue signaling in
Yeah.
an extreme way. And not only that, of course, it always pisses everybody off. The only place for a just man is jail. You spent a night there, Thoreau. You let your aunt pay the fine. I'm not really impressed.
Yeah, and Emerson Emerson Wright owns the chunk of Walden Pond that Thoreau is staying on, and presumably Emerson got that money from giving talks in Boston. So sure, this I have always been critical of Thoreau because his claim that he is withdrawing from society is not true. It's not true in some way. This takes us, though, I think, now we can jump over the 130 years between the composition of these two essays, because what Arendt is writing about is not just the Crito and resistance to civil government, these two essays, but this new thing. I mean, new. Gandhi had been practicing it for decades, and then it had been practiced in the United States under the influence of Bayard Rustin for, only 10 or 15 years. This new thing that is resistance to civil government made explicitly nonviolent and then turned into an active, an active mass campaign. And this also, at the time she's writing this in 1970, I don't know if they knew this yet. You can tell me what you think. It's also dead. It's gone. I mean, whatever, 1958 to 1968, RIP, the American civil disobedience as mass movement. Did they know in 1970, John, that it was over?
No, no, because the response to the Cambodia. So 1970 and even into 1971, but 1970 in particular, because of course that's when Kent State happens, and it happens because of the invasion of Cambodia.
Yeah.
And the colleges were shut down across the whole country. So 1970 was as extreme a year of civil disobedience as 1968. Yeah, so let me go back for just a second. but this fits with the Arendt because she makes a distinction between the conscientious objector and the person of civil disobedience. And the conscientious objector is Thoreau. It's the person who individually says, I will be a martyr. I will suffer because I can't live with myself and my sense of what's right unless I stand up and object to this. And Thoreau crazily has this, assertion that this will change the world. And, Arendt's not buying it at all. She's saying it's an individual action. It has no effect at all. Its only reason is to calm your own conscience, your own sense of integrity. And going back even further to our point about, where's the place to stand in an unjust world, in some sense, the extreme answer is Bartleby. There's no place to stand. You just say, I prefer not to the point of death.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so thank you for bringing up Herman Melville. I always prefer the podcast when it contain at least one mention of Herman Melville.
Well,
And
like
this
the
is
London Review of Books, one mention of Hannah Arendt.
yes. I'll get to that in a second. We got to read that. But I do take Melville to be in Bartleby to be criticizing Thoreau, because if you haven't read the Bartleby story, and you should, it's one of the greatest. I mean, if I had to pick one work of short fiction that I thought was the greatest work of short fiction ever, if I had to choose, it's a silly game, but if I had to, it would be Bartleby. That's my number one, and it's just a man who decides he's going to check out of society, and that just means that you starve and die. There is no checking out of society. There isn't.
There can be a right to secede, but full secession is impossible.
Or is death. Full secession is death, is another way of putting it. So let's stop, though, and introduce Hannah Arendt. And I'm going to start with this letter to the editor in the London Review of Books that I just flagged and thought was delightful. This is from December 26, 2024. John Hanaho of Granryd, Dinbyshire. That might be Wales. I don't know. But he writes, where's Hannah? Is there some contractual obligation, or perhaps an office joke, that Hannah Arendt's name must appear in every edition of the London Review of Books? My wife and I test how thoroughly we've read each issue by checking who has spotted her. I note, for instance, that in the excellent article by Joanne O'Leary about Delmore Schwartz in the LRB of 21 November, we are told William Barrett remembered Schwartz dismissing Arendt as a, quote, Weimar Republic flapper. Now, first of all, well done, John Hanaho. That was funny. I just want to congratulate the LRB reader, John Hanaho. But I also want to make the point that I don't know the full story of Arendt, but certainly these days, definitely since the Trump election in 2016, Arendt wrote a book on revolution. Arendt wrote a book on totalitarianism. Arendt wrote the famous, it was controversial then, but is now pretty much universally accepted, idea of the banality of evil. Hannah Arendt is a philosopher who I don't know if people are really reading. I will say that when Trump was reelected, there immediately popped up in the offices of Greenlaw, which is the building that I work in and where John worked in, there was a sign immediately that said Hannah Arendt reading group, email for details. So I guess it's a secret Hannah Arendt reading group. They're not having public meetings. But people turn to Arendt when they want to explain totalitarianism, Nazism, fascism. And so since we seem to be living in those times, people want their Hannah Arendt. She has to be in every LRB. So I'm sorry to do this to you after we've been talking for 40 minutes, but can you tell us who Hannah Arendt is?
Yeah, so Arendt was a German Jew. She came from a secular family, was not a religious Jew, went through the German university system, famously had an affair with Martin Heidegger when she was 17 years old and starting university. And then she was arrested very early after Hitler took power and spent 11 days in prison. She was not arrested as a Jew. This was before Hitler had begun persecuting the Jews. She was arrested because she was in communist circles. She was not a communist herself, but she had, in fact, among other things, harbored some communists who were going underground once Hitler took power. She was released from prison. This is 1933. It's early, early days, and immediately left. And she went to Paris, and she lived in Paris until she was detained as an enemy alien when the war began. So she was in a concentration camp, a detention camp, and she was there when France fell and famously walked out of the camp and made her way to the border where she reunited with her husband through, he had done the same thing because the sexes were separated. He was a German communist, non-Jew. They eventually made their way to New York, and then in New York, she became involved in the New York intellectual circles. Like Marcuse, and not unlike Adorno, she accepted that she was going to be working in English, so she worked incredibly hard to become an English speaker and wrote her books in English. And the reason the totalitarianism book has actually three things in it that make it prescient. One is she was obsessed with the notion of statelessness, and then the issue of human rights and the paradoxes of human rights. If there's not a state to protect them, then how do they get protected? Is there any way to make them work? And she was pessimistic about that, even as she saw the need for it. Then also about how is it that totalitarian regimes get the consent of the governed? What are their techniques for getting people to consent to actually be fervent followers? And then the final thing was that she saw that the techniques of colonialism, so it connects into the whole anti-colonial movements post-World War II, that the techniques of colonialism to subdue the colonized peoples were then brought home to the home country as the basis for totalitarian actions. So in all of those ways, she just offers an analysis that just seems again and again to recur even after we vainly thought these things were put behind us.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I say again that I thought in 2020 that we had put these things behind us. Again, again, I thought we had put these things behind us. I wasn't. Again, I'm taking this away, but I wasn't on the lookout for regular old fascism. I was on the lookout, and I say this as a someone in college who didn't think the Iraq War was that good of an idea, but also was really hopeful that the Iraq War would lead to freedom and justice prevailing in the Middle East. It seemed to me that when fascism came in the 21st century, it would come in the guise of compassionate conservatism and free markets and liberty for all. But now we just have regular old fascism. I wasn't ready for this, and I must admit I thought Arendt was a kind of outdated figure in 2012. I was wrong. I was wrong. Let's before we get to the essay, the one thing, and I mean, and you've raised this already. I just view Arendt as a sort of what's the line in James Joyce? A pier is a disappointed bridge. I view her as a sort of like disappointed anarchist. She, says that the state will not do a good job of protecting people, but then she says, but we need the state anyway. She says Israel should not be able to be an ethno state, but then says, oh, but we do still need is Israel. I read her reasoning and I wait for her to make the anarchist conclusion. And then I just see her sort of saying, like, well, it's not going to work, but we'll figure it out anyways. Or we have no choice. We have to use the state in a way that doesn't that doesn't fit. So does that critique make sense to you, or am I just, I don't know, just take it
Yeah.
away?
Well, I think it's because she is obsessed with power and the fact that power coagulates, if you want to use it that term, power concentrates, it gathers in places. And so then she has a very extreme and again prescient critique of sovereignty. And what she wants to do is fracture sovereignty and disperse power. So, in that sense, absolutely, she's a decentralization thinker, and that's an anarchist idea. She also is quite clearly interested in participatory democracy. She has deep suspicion of representative government because it turns people passive. And so, that gets us directly to the essay. I mean, the oddest thing in the essay, she says, we need a constitutional amendment to, place civil disobedience as a completely recognized and accepted part of political life.
Yeah.
But what she's really saying, I mean, that seems wild, but what she's really saying is civil disobedience is a model of the people in action. And that's precisely what she hates in the scene that she sees is how passive people are. So she wants to reactivate people. She likes civil disobedience because it's not individual action of the Thoreau type, but it's actually collective action. And not only that, because it's collective, she says, then it's political. Thoreau's action is moral. Civil disobedience is political. And civil disobedience is political not only because it's collective, because it also has an aim to actually change the relations between people within a confined space. So a nation, and she doesn't. I mean, I shouldn't say nation because she hates nations actually, um, because she's seen what nationalism does. But a polity is bounded. It has geographical boundaries. It's the people who live together within those boundaries. And what she wants is for the people to shape the relations within that boundary, not to passively accept what's handed down to them. So, in that sense, she's anarchist. In the sense, she definitely is suspicious of top down power.
So this, I mean, I think this is just perfect. This is maybe something, John, that you and I have been, I don't know, dancing around for a long time. So I'm gonna come up with a formulation. Then, are you ready? So Hannah Arendt, like John Dewey, James C. Scott, and John McGowan, could be described as a sort of everyday anarchist, meaning they want grassroots participatory government, assembly, protest, action, but they don't think that tearing down, the basic fundamental structures of the state or the polity are actually going to lead to this flowering of everyday anarchism, but they think it can happen within those structures. And you can speak for yourself or all four if you would like.
Well, I mean, in terms of the Arendt essay, of course, she says civil disobedience is just another example of voluntary association, which Tocqueville said was the great genius of American political life. And all she's saying is voluntary associations can't flourish unless they are protected within the framework of a set of laws. And not only a set of laws, but a set of laws that are enforceable, which gets us back to the beginning of her essay, where she says, we may have reached the point where the laws in the United States are not enforceable. In the chaos of the late 60s, 1970, the law, people have lost so much respect for the law that it can't be enforced. And that to her, if that's anarchy, that she is terrified of. She is terrified of that because of her experience of fascism as precisely the suspension of all legal barriers to violence, to state oppression, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I also want to mention that when she mentions anarchy mostly in a negative way, she does mention that it's clear that the first followers of Christ were anarchists. So that's just yet another plug for early Christianity being an anarchist commune, which I love bringing up. At least in these here United States, Christianity is taken to be the enemy of anarchism, but they don't know their early church history. Um, yeah, I mean, I think this makes sense. The fear of anarchy, right, drives one to some sort of structure. Even someone like Hannah Arendt, who is clearly aligned with the the same principles that animated King and Gandhi and Tolstoy and Thoreau. She wants them, but she wants, she's worried about the baby and the bath water, and that's why she ultimately falls back on laws and states. Does that sound right?
Well, again, two things. The first is, let's talk about the law. I mean, I think what she's saying, and I believe this is true. If Trump does not accept the court decisions against the illegal things that he's currently doing, if Trump basically says the laws are suspended, my administration can do whatever it wants, the only alternative to that is violence. And Arendt saw the violence of World War II, saw the violence of the Holocaust, and says, violence, the violence of the American Civil War, the violence is not really a good alternative to the attempt to make the structure of the law work. The other thing, though, is we have to really radically distinguish between Gandhi and King.
Yeah.
And Arendt goes there. She says, look, Gandhi was a revolutionary because Gandhi actually wants to overthrow the whole structure of laws. King is a reformist. King wants to say, hey, you've got a set of laws. I just want you to actually abide by them, and treat that's a 14th Amendment, people. Let's see you make that amendment a reality in terms of your behavior. So Gandhi has no respect for British law. He's a strategist. He's using a particular strategy that's going to win the world's consent. And, this gets us to the issue of, how effective nonviolence is in terms of the fact that civil disobedience is a rhetorical act. It's an act meant to persuade those who are on the fence. But in any case, Gandhi and King are radically different figures for that reason.
Yeah, I think this is a really important distinction. I like the thrill for me is putting things together, and I appreciate you pulling them apart at certain times, because I will run them together to a point that they end up a goop. Um, there are a few things. One, I just wanted to briefly say there's another really tricky place. I said we weren't going to talk about the Crito, but now we have to talk about the Crito. The Crito is mind blowing because Socrates in the Crito says, "Oh, his friends say, let's illegally break you out of this prison," and Socrates says, "Me? Do something illegal? No, law is good, and I respect the law of Athens." And that doesn't sound like Socrates. He's being put to death for not respecting the law of Athens.
Yeah,
You have,
but so again, Arendt makes this clear, and as Socrates did, he was given the choice of secession. He was told he could choose between exile and death, and he didn't choose exile
yeah,
because his identity is entirely bound up with being a member of this community. And I mean, and the way Arendt then plays that out, right, is she wants to say civil disobedience, the descent of civil disobedience, is actually a species of consent.
mm-hmm.
And it's a species of consent precisely because you don't secede, precisely because you say, as a citizen of this polity, I am addressing my fellow citizens in this dramatic staging of what I see as injustice. And I want you to awaken to the fact of the injustice and join me in protesting against it and offering remedies to it. And so Socrates is saying, that's what I was doing. Socrates' problem was, he didn't have a big enough a mass movement, right?
Yeah.
He's still too individualistic. But
And
he refuses secession, and that explains his his decision. And
and
that's what
he
she's saying. That's why she's saying dissent is a form of consent, because dissent is saying I I accept my membership in this society. I'm not seceding. And that's what, in a sense, Thoreau doesn't do, even as he gets all the benefits of being a member anyway.
yeah.
Because he,
Okay, this is great. So before we go back to Thoreau, this really clearly explains, and I mean, you already did this, but I just want to reiterate the distinction between King and Gandhi. King is not a black nationalist. King is willing to live as a citizen of the United States of America, and he's constantly talking about the higher law. And in one sense, the higher law is, it's a religious law. In another sense, it's simply a moral law. But in another sense, that by the higher law, he just means the Constitution and the Bill of Rights.
yeah,
These ideals, I mean, it sounds like Frederick Douglass, right? These
exactly. Yeah,
ideals stand, and I'm just asking you to join me in supporting these ideals. Gandhi is not consenting to the higher law of, I don't know who would have been George. I don't remember who the monarch is there. Eventually, it's Elizabeth. Gandhi is not consenting. Gandhi is saying this is my resistance to civil government has as its aim the overthrow of that particular government. And the tragedy of Gandhi's movement is it is successful and puts in place another government that he does not like and would not have supported, but he's not around to do anything about it. Now I think this makes sense again to take us back to Thoreau. Thoreau I mean, Thoreau does John. Okay, so I think everything you said about Thoreau makes sense, but he does seem to think that he can stop the machine from from working. It does seem like your critique, or if you would like Arendt's critique, seems right. How could he stop the machine from working? But he doesn't. Thoreau doesn't say, "I am doing this and it makes no difference and doesn't matter, and I'm just going to be happy on Walden Pond." Thoreau says if all men of conscience do this, we will stop the government from doing its colonial expansion into the West and stop the government from supporting slavery. So I'm not quite ready to abandon Thoreau as someone who wanted sweeping change. He claims to want sweeping change.
yeah. But of course, then he also claims it has nothing to do with me. I mean, he says quite
Yeah.
explicitly, right? I mean, I always, when I read Thoreau, I always think of Alice's Restaurant. That moment when Arlo Guthrie says, if one person, and if two people go into the shrink and say, we're gay, and then if three people do it, maybe we'll have a movement. Well, Thoreau doesn't even begin the thinking of what it would mean to have a movement. In fact, he says just the opposite. It's not my business. I wash my hands of it. He says I mean, that's a quote. I wash
Yeah.
my hands of it.
I mean, that's got to be a Pontius
I
Pilate.
have other things to do, he
Yeah.
says. And when you read it, it's in some ways very attractive. Why should we be consumed by this horror that's we're watching? We've got one life to live, and being consumed by the news and tuned into our whatever pundits we're listening to. It doesn't seem like a life.
Yeah, I mean, and that is, I mean, this again is a place where I think there's probably broad agreement among all of these thinkers, although none of them addressed MSNBC and Rachel Maddow. But I just don't understand, John, my friends who are just obsessed with Rachel Maddow and MSNBC, and they just want the exact theater that the Trumpists are being served, but a mirror image of it. They seem to just watch hours a day, and they're on Twitter, and it's just like, oh, did you see the new filing in such and such court case? And I just think, how can that how can that be how you are living your life? But it seems
Yeah.
that King and Arendt, this, if you want to call this critique anarchist, King and Arendt and John Dewey would all agree with it. That is not government. That, let's say, that is not democracy. That is not consent. That is not anything that anyone from Jefferson through Hamilton would recognize. That's closer to the old Colosseum, bread and circuses spectacle, government as spectacle. And that's the fact that that spectacle seems to have, in other words, if we've been dividing, and I think you've been really good about splitting these people apart from one another, it's time to put them together and say all of them broadly would be disgusted not just by what Trump is doing, but by the people who, I had friends, if you can recall all this way back, listeners, I have friends who just like were obsessed with Mueller. It was just like bad things are happening, but luckily there's a guy in a suit and he is going to save our country. And that's not going to do it. That's just not going to do it.
Right. And so then it becomes a question of who's going to provide the models for action. And I think it's very clear that the models for action on the left are exhausted. Demonstrations are useless. I mean, demonstrations do not do anything. They just say, we're here. Well, we know we're here. 49% of us voted against this clown. So then what would be a good models of action? And it's really, really tough, I think. I've been trying to think about this, reading these things, because there's a very weird dynamic or taboo about violence. If the model became, as in 1970 and 1971 was tried in Washington, D.C., let's shut down the city because what we're going to do, it's a city dependent on bridges. We're just going to sit in the bridges and no one's going to be able to get into D.C. They didn't have a metro yet at that point. No one's going to be able to get into D.C. for the day. Well, the weird thing about that is how much it backfires.
Yeah.
And that's not even violent. That's just obstructionist. So what are the forms that civil disobedience could take that would actually, not only, be collective action and getting off your butt and not watching Rachel Maddow, but would actually prove effective in a highly volatile rhetorical situation? It's just like the guy who just got arrested, the Colombian student, utterly illegally.
Columbia student.
Right. Right.
He's not Colombian, he's Palestinian. Yeah, sorry.
He's Algerian, actually.
Oh, Algerian.
He's an Algerian citizen, but has a green card. Warrantless arrests, completely and utterly illegal. But, man, I wouldn't want to take a poll about Americans, how many, agree with this, and then what action in support of him, would actually, stir public opinion to recognize that this is a terrible thing that's just happened.
Yeah, the only other thing I want to mention is that the activism that seems like maybe it's working is people are trying to get rid of Tesla stock and Teslas to hurt to hurt the perception, the false perception that Elon Musk is a very smart and successful businessman. And if in the face of something like someone with a green card getting arrested in complete defiance of every bit of rule of law, the best thing you can think to do is to tank the stock price of a billionaire. This is a bad time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, no evidence of Trump as a man who has lost billions of dollars during his life seems to have penetrated the American psyche. We somehow still think of him as a genius of some sort.
I mean, I still have not done an episode about De Boer, but it just seems like we are living in the society of the spectacle, and we need to finish soon. I don't want this to be too long, but it seems like actually, in a certain way, Occupy, which didn't claim to be about spectacle, Occupy claimed to be about creating a new way of living in the world. Who knows? I still like to think that maybe it would have if they hadn't, torn it down and beaten those people up with sticks. But Occupy was also an effective spectacle. You could see it on TV, and on TV, it did look like a different way of living. And I'm sorry to keep criticizing Maddow, who I have watched probably less than an hour of Maddow in the 20 years she's been on television. But I can't remember why, but I accidentally came across the Rachel Maddow show. This was last year, when she was interviewing that douchebag, what's his name, Michael Cohen, Trump's
Uh-huh.
sleazeball fixer, who finally turned on him. And she was, maybe this is how she always is, but I doubt it. She just seemed giddy to be talking to Michael Cohen. She was in awe. She was excited. Michael Cohen, who is neither good at anything nor interesting in any way, but was elevated by Trump to be the main character of the media sphere. And as another person in the media sphere, Rachel Maddow just seemed delighted to be basking in his glow, which is really the reflected glow of Trump, which is really just the fact that Trump was on TV a lot. And anything that gets people out of that reflected glow and into the work of making the world a better place, it just seems like those are the models we need to see. And in that respect, maybe Occupy was, insofar as the Women's March or whatever was sort of pure spectacle and was again just sort of the reflected glow of Trump. I think Occupy might have been different, but I am just coming up with this idea, so I haven't thought about it much.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me because I don't, and I've never seen Rachel Maddow, so I have nothing to say about Rachel Maddow. But what's hard for me is that the critique always seems to be the same and gets continually displaced. So, the current critique is, oh, well, the problem is there's no public sphere anymore because there's just the virtual sphere, and we're all on our phones and don't connect to one another, and therefore people don't know how to act in public in the ways that, Arendt is looking to in civil disobedience. And of course, that's Arendt's critique. And Arendt's critique is the reason why fascism succeeds is because modern conditions isolate people and they live in states of loneliness and there's no longer any community. And she's saying this is true of 1930. Then you go back to Thoreau or to Ruskin or to any of the various romantic criticisms of modernity, and they say the same exact thing. And this is continue. They keep moving the ball back. In my grandparents' days, they knew all their neighbors, and neighbors would come for a barn raising. And then while the grandparents were saying, in my grandparents' days. So I just don't know what to do with these critiques. And I tend to want to be more focused on just the pragmatic question. What kind of actions, what kind of political actions actually bear fruit? How do you move the needle? And, what seems terrible at the moment is that it seems so hard to move the needle. I keep on going back to 2006. Bush fucked up the Iraq War and the response to Katrina, and the populace made the Republican Party pay the price. That's why in 2008, there were 60 Democratic senators. That's how Obamacare got passed, because you had a filibuster-proof Democratic majority in the Senate. We look now and we say, how the hell would you even get to 52 Democratic senators, no less 60? There seems to be no accountability at all. It seems to be, and so that's the question. How would you move the needle so there actually was accountability, that the public actually said, what the Republican Party has done And maybe the only thing is economic. Maybe, I have to be totally Marxist about this. If Trump succeeds, as he seems determined to succeed, at completely, trashing the U.S. economy, maybe the public will actually say, hey, not such a good idea to have these guys in charge.
Yeah, I and that makes the Tesla stock price thing like that actually is.
Yeah, it may
That's
be the
our
canary in the mind. It may be
yeah.
with the stock market stuff, but again, the stock market's so bizarre because it's so disconnected from economic reality.
Yeah, your beloved Noah Smith once said that people need to stop saying that GDP isn't the real economy. GDP is the real economy. But
Well,
that's just silly.
Noah Smith just had a wonderful. I'm going to make you read it. Just had a wonderful
Jesus
thing
Christ.
on exactly this issue of the the lack of accountability. And anyway, it's an interesting article about what some of these right wing intellectuals believe, which is just terrifying.
Right wing intellectuals like Noah Smith.
No, he's taking issue with them.
Other right wing intellectuals. Further right wing
That's right.
intellectuals.
The
Yeah.
ones who actually like Trump.
Yes. Okay. Fair enough. Um I guess the only thing, I mean, look, this was thrilling, John. This was
Yeah,
so
that's
much
fun.
fun. The
Absolutely.
the only thing I think I need us to have as a takeaway is there it does seem again that we've got sort of broad agreement with all of these thinkers that the sort of like to maintain rule of law, if rule of law is something you want, and if you're trying to avoid anarchy in its bad sense, then a sort of the sort of like broken windows model doesn't hold. In fact, breaking the law is a form or can be a form of consenting to the law. And there needs to be, I would say, there needs to be a broader awareness or desire on the left, on the progressive left, and by progressive I mean to the right of me. Normally when people talk about progressives they mean to the left of the moderates, but I mean to the right of me, the people who would say like, oh, I don't like anarchists, they're always breaking the law. But in fact, breaking the law doesn't make you an anarchist necessarily. In fact, you can't find anyone, I can't find anyone on the left, truly on the left, who would not accept that there are times, places, and cases where the law needs to be broken and a narrow legalistic understanding of the law is missing what the law is for, which is supposedly a just and fair place. I mean, it's hard for me to say that from the anarchist position, but it does seem like we can agree on that. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I mean, the classic distinction for this is reform versus revolution. And I mean, I guess the question is, where does anarchism come down on that? The progressive liberal is still within the realm of reform, saying, I don't want to tear down the whole structure of the law. I just want to reform the law and make it better. And in fact, there are all kinds of important safeguards that having the law, be functioning and enforceable, those safeguards need to be in place. And the revolutionary says, no, we got to smash the whole thing to the ground because it's so brutally unjust and violent, etc. And
So the
so,
question,
where's the anarchist? Reform or revolution? Pick your choice.
so the question of where anarchists sit on reform versus revolution, I would say that's not that's not an option. I mean, Graeber would never call himself a reformist. But Graeber is clearly a reformist. I mean, he called himself a revolutionary, but he was clearly a reformist. Colin Ward is clearly a reformist. So you can be an anarchist revolutionary or an anarchist reformist. That's not the question I want to raise. What I'm talking to, John, is the progressives who say, look, of course, I'm against the war, but those students should not have been there. They were breaking the law, and the fact that they got arrested was on them. I have heard people say that. You haven't heard
Okay,
people
I'm
say that?
surprised. No, I haven't
Yeah.
because,
Okay.
and I hate to do this, but I have a couple of friends at Columbia, and they were, you know, very loud voices in disliking everything the administration was doing in support of the students and of the students' right to protest and, even to civilly disobey, which, I mean, was mildest forms of disobedience if you compare it to anything that happened in the late 60s and 70s and early 70s.
Okay, good. So we have agreement. We have liberal, progressive, socialist, and anarchist agreement that students should be able to protest and make their voices heard and assemble, even if those protests and assembly might be technically, in the narrow sense, in the lower law sense of MLK, illegal.
Yeah, right. I mean, but again, that's what civil disobedience is. It's knowledgeable, it's knowing and public. I mean, Arendt keeps stressing that it's public disobedience. It's not like criminal activity or other kinds of breaking of the law with a whole, when you commit fraud, you don't go out in public and say, hey, watch me commit fraud. So the difference between doing something secretly and trying to keep it a secret and doing something publicly is crucial to the whole act.
I mean, I think that's great. Anything else, John, you want to say before we go?
No, that's good. Let's find some place we can go out and act in public, Graham.
I've got a few more weeks before I'm off crutches, so I can't act
You
any
can't
in public.
march yet.
I would also like to remind you that I am, unlike you, I am employed, and unlike you, when you were employed, I do not have tenure or any other protections. I mean, look, this hits really close. Maybe I have to delete this, John. Maybe I won't be able to publish this. But this is the tyranny of the workplace. I started this podcast because I was outraged at the tyranny of the workplace, and my current workplace, which is the same place you worked, is not tyrannical at all in my day to day life, whereas the other one was day to day, small scale surveillance tyranny. But the Republicans run the state, John, and the Republicans run the university that I work for and you worked for. And if I go march with you in my boot to protect my injured Achilles tendon, I may no longer be able to feed my family. What is that? What is that? What would Arendt say to that?
Right. Well, I mean, that we should have another whole podcast on that because the both psychological and economic necessities of work, of how much people's self-worth as well as their ability to pay the rent is wrapped up in having a job. And so I will end with that. My daughter is one of the people who has lost her job because of Elon Musk directly. She has been fired. And not only that means losing health insurance also, of course. So yeah, the stick of economic employment is an incredibly powerful one, especially since it also carries these psychological burdens as well.
And this shows you that, like, Hayekian rhetoric about freedom
Yeah.
is a lie.
Yeah.
It's simply a lie.
Right. I mean, that's the secret on that has been out for 200 years. I mean, that anybody can believe that is only from a position of enjoying the power to coerce others.
Yeah, the workplace, it is the
A
power
free,
to
a
coerce
free
others.
contract of labor with capital.
Oh, delightful, John. I look forward to seeing you again in person soon, and we can do this soon again as well. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Graham. It was lots of fun.